I'm using 3/8 inch pine. Plywood would work well, especially 1/2 inch. You'll see why later. I start off by ripping a 4-inch strip, and then I follow up by ripping a 3/4 inch strip. This one is 3/4 because 2 times 3/8, so if you're using 1/2 inch, it would be 1 inch. Now I'm cutting 2 pieces at 8 inches from each the 4-inch strip and the 3/4 inch strip. And then I add a single hole in one of the larger pieces, and I'm just using the router table because I want things to line up, because I'm adding this 1/4 inch slot on the other piece, nearly the full length. I'm pre-drilling some runners. Now the runners help keep the jig square to the table. As you can see here, here's a rough idea of how it works. It slides back and forth, but the bottom piece needs to stay square to the miter slot. So I'm using super glue just to initially attach the runners to the bottom piece. These are not the permanent way to attach it, because once the glue is dry, I take it off and I add some screws to keep the runners attached. After securing those, I take the top piece over to the miter saw. I'm cutting a 15-degree angle 2 ways so it makes a point in the center of this piece. This is room for the bearing. I then take everything over to the table saw and I just check that the slot's big enough where it can actually reach the blade. I'm attaching a bearing that the wood will ride against, and I'm using a bolt, so remember earlier when I said 1/2 inch plywood would work well? Well, that's because with 3/8 I had to hog out some extra material to give room for both the bearing and the bolt. Now I have to cut a slot for the bolt, and I'm using the router table again. Notice I haven't used a drill press on this because the router table I can set up once and cut everything. But now we're ready for assembly. The first thing I have to do is attach these runners. Well, I guess they're a second pair of runners. These are from the 3/4 inch board, and these fit on the side of the top piece so it can slide square to the bottom piece, just using glue and pin nails. Next, I'm adding the miter bolt through the hole in the bottom, through the slot, and this is what keeps the jig attached to the table and at the right measurement. I then attach the bearing, and for the bolt here I'm using a locking nut because I don't want this thing to unscrew itself while I'm using it. And that's all it takes for assembly, so I take it over to the table saw and I mark out the measurements of this thing. So I start off with the 0, just putting the bearing right up against the saw blade teeth. Not the blade itself, but the teeth. After that, I use setup blocks to mark out other measurements I care about, for example in 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch, and setup blocks really make this part a lot easier. Now the only thing left is to test it out. So as you can see, what I do here is I just move the gauge over to whatever line I want for the measurement, and then you put the material there, butt the fence up against it, and then you're ready to actually run the material through.